Hi everyone, my name is Jocelyn Kaza with Everbridge, and thanks for joining us today. Today's agenda focuses on resiliency as a cornerstone of a future-fit technology strategy and competitive advantage. Our speaker today is Stephanie Balaouras, who is the VP and Group Research Director at Forrester. She leads the research organization that serves infrastructure and operations professionals and security and risk professionals. Before we begin, I wanted to let you know that we'll be recording the session and making it available on demand after today. Okay, let's jump into the presentation. Stephanie, take it away.
So obviously today's theme is on resiliency, but I want to talk about resiliency in the context of a major theme at Forrester called Future Fit. Forrester is a company, I think actually we're close to 300 to 400 people in the research organization itself. We are researching everything from the future of work to climate change and sustainability and everything in between, marketing, technology. This is one of those research themes that actually cuts across everything that Forrester does. There's 4 major themes that we're focused on for this year that we expect every research team and every analyst to contribute to, and also to link to and connect to in the body of their research. The future of work, the future of buying, the trust imperative, and this is a key one specifically focused on technology, which is called Future Fit. And this one is important because it addresses the core of technology strategy, and resiliency is actually a core pillar of this theme, which I'll get into. What drove Forrester to really focus on this theme is a couple of trends. It's interesting, for all the talk of digital disruption and all the massive investments that companies have been making in technology for the last decade, it hasn't necessarily produced a lot. If you look at a lot of companies, if you look at everything from their website experiences to their mobile apps to their hybrid experience strategies, it hasn't necessarily produced a lot of breakthrough performance or true differentiation. You could look at the mobile app for every airline. They all have the same functionality. You look at website experiences, you look at payment technologies. Companies have just been keeping up with each other. Their investments in tech haven't really led to true differentiation, which we call digital sameness. The other thing that we're seeing, which is a troubling trend, is historically, as companies have invested in technology, we've seen a huge boost in productivity. That trend is actually now reversing. So investments in tech are actually leading, I shouldn't say it's a direct correlation, but our investments in techs have not been bolstering productivity. In fact, productivity has been falling. And the last one is increasing technical debt. I'm particularly close to this last trend because I see it so often in clients around resiliency. Right now I'm working with a client. They have 1,500 applications strewn across 4 different data centers. If you look at their technology stack from the application layer all the way down to the infrastructure, it's complex, it's heterogeneous. They have every flavor of database, operating system, virtual technology. They have a mainframe in there, multiple mainframes. When you look at their ability to actually create a resilient environment, it's almost impossible. It's all incredibly manual. They have to take different approaches to how they protect data, how they fail over applications. So the technical debt and the complexity, I think it has one of the biggest impacts on resiliency. It has a huge impact on adaptability as well. So these were some of the bigger trends that we wanted to try to address with our clients. And this is where the Future Fit strategy comes in. So this is our model for Future Fit. And just to put a specific definition to it, it's an approach to technology where a company truly focuses on their ability to become adaptive and creative and resilient. When you think about a lot of technology strategy, it's focused on becoming efficient. It's focused on just meeting or aligning to business needs. It's focused on sort of becoming this ubiquitous utility. That doesn't actually lead to breakthroughs in differentiation and competition. It doesn't actually dramatically improve resilience. It doesn't allow you to adapt to changing consumer demands and market demands and new competition. It just sort of, you're keeping up with the status quo is all that it does. So Future Fit technology, you're completely reorienting your technology strategy and your investments around these 3 pillars: creativity, adaptivity, and resilience. And most of this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on resilience, but it's worth talking about adaptiveness and creativeness as well. And the interesting thing about adaptiveness is there is a tie into resiliency, where resiliency, as we'll get to in a moment, is really about your ability to quickly react to sudden events, sudden changes, crises that happen in the moment. Adaptiveness is about your ability to predict changing market trends and customer trends, consumer buying behaviors, new competition, so that you can adapt to those trends. But sometimes there's a blurring of them. In many cases, a lot of the investments that you have to make to be more adaptive, things like investing in cloud for scale, for flexibility, for the ability to develop and deliver applications rapidly. Those are the same kinds of capabilities that contribute to a more resilient environment. So there's a blurring between the two. But resilience is more about any sudden crisis, whereas adaptiveness is a little bit more about longer term trends that you're reacting to. So just another definition: adaptiveness, the ability to reconfigure your core business concepts and even your core business capabilities and core technology capabilities. Creative, the definition that we're using is about bringing emotion and engagement to digital customer experiences, really creating differentiating experiences. You think this past year and a half with the pandemic, you think about the companies that were able to quickly adjust their customer experiences for hybrid environments, being able to switch from in-person to online, and to make those online experiences actually personable, or make them more hybrid, where they're ordering online and then they're picking up in person, rolling out completely new applications, new capabilities. Resilient, as I mentioned, delivering on your product and your brand promise, no matter what the crisis. And so we'll see organizations that express this need for future fit. I've got a couple of quotes that I think are very telling. When companies talk about the need to be creative, these are some of the things they talk about. And these are actual customer quotes. I need to understand what great customer experience looks like for a B2B wholesale business, and the must-have e-commerce features to facilitate repeat customer purchases. This is what adaptiveness sounds like when organizations are hungry for adaptiveness. We are modernizing the systems that slow us down. Cloud platforms will increase for customers and employees. That's the interesting thing about cloud now, is that cloud is not about just saving money. Cloud is actually about scale, flexibility, performance, differentiation. It's the enablement platform for organizations. And then resilience. My top priority of the business has never changed: deliver a high-performing technology organization that leads with stability and resiliency. And we picked different types of clients to just kind of show the demand for the different capabilities around future fit. And we've done some analysis as well. This is from a survey that we did late last year, where we surveyed companies and we surveyed them for characteristics and metrics that defined just how adaptive and creative and resilient they were. And I should say, there are very few companies that I think demonstrate all three of these. They tend to be stronger in one or two areas than all three of them. But when we surveyed companies that we felt, for example, really had the characteristics of a resilient organization, and we looked at their actual revenue growth, they were 2.5 times the industry average. So this is leading to direct financial performance and business performance, and that true differentiation that we're looking for. So to focus in on resiliency, I just to reiterate the definition, because I think that term resiliency gets thrown around a lot. And it can be abstract or it can be meaningless because people don't put an actual definition to it. So that's why I reiterate the definition over and over again. This is our vision and definition for resilience. So it's the ability of an organization to deliver on its vision and brand promise, no matter the crisis. And that's important, like whether you're a B2C company, whether you're a B2B company, whether your ultimate end customer is another company, like a client, whether it's a consumer, whether it's a patient, whoever your ultimate end customer is, it's delivering on your vision and brand promise to them, regardless of the crisis. And the crisis could be anything from a product recall. It could be extreme weather, it could be IT failure, it could be a cybersecurity event. It doesn't matter the crisis, it's your ability to actually absorb it and continuing to deliver on that promise, as opposed to actually being down and going through some complex recovery. You're continuing to deliver on your vision no matter what. And I think, resiliency, even before the pandemic, I'd seen an increase in a resurgence in business continuity and overall resiliency. In my 20 plus career covering business continuity and other topics within technology infrastructure, you'd always sort of see this waxing and waning of interest. There'd be some sort of major event, and then everybody would scramble and say, are we prepared? Or there'd be a major extreme weather event that we go through. So there was always this ebb and flow to interest and investment in business continuity and other types of resiliency capabilities. But I would say over the last few years, it's been incredibly consistent. One is there is just a changing perception from customers, whether they're consumers, other organizations. There's just an expectation that companies are going to be available no matter what. And also the environment itself is becoming riskier. Some analysts on my team did this analysis where we looked at major systemic risk events, the kinds of events that could truly bring down an organization, not just disrupt you. Things like extreme weather, like hurricanes, wildfires, pandemics and epidemics, and other kinds of disease outbreaks, as well as things like major recessions, particularly global recessions. And we did an analysis from the 70s. And across the board, in some cases, these events are increasing by 4x. So we are looking at a much riskier environment. In fact, when it comes to our future of work research, systemic risk is actually one of the 4 major shocks over the next decade that we think every company has to be ready and prepared for. So, given this increasing frequency of systemic risk events, and then kind of understanding the need for future fit technology and the role that plays in business performance, you see resiliency become crucial from multiple angles. And there was another topic I was potentially going to cover, which is the trust imperative. But just to cover it quickly, we do believe over the next decade, organizations that are able to become trustworthy with customers, with employees, with partners, as well as other stakeholders, they'll be the ones that create really hard to break bonds with customers. They'll attract and retain the best talent for their companies. They'll be able to roll out emerging and disruptive technology that people actually embrace as opposed to fear, because it brings about dystopian future events. And we actually looked at the levers of trust. That's the other thing with trust is people, we're human beings. We relate to the concept of trust. We think we understand it, but we actually looked at a lot of academic research and ran some quantitative studies and identified 7 critical levers of trust. And one of the top levers of trust is actually dependability. And resiliency is a core contributor to this sense of dependability. And we actually looked at it from the perspective of different types of businesses, whether you delivered luxury goods to clients, whether you were a service-oriented business, whether you were a convenience-oriented business. Dependability was actually the number 1 lever of trust. So if from multiple angles, risk, future fit, from trust, resiliency is at the center of so many trends happening right now. And it's during these crisis events where an organization gets to demonstrate their character and their resiliency capabilities. In fact, we're working on a lot of research for the second half of the year where we're going to look at crisis as an opportunity to actually build trust. How you actually operate during a crisis will make or break the company. And in so many cases, we see companies make a crisis worse, particularly in some of the cybersecurity events that we've seen recently. They often make it worse. But the crisis can actually be the opportunity to reveal your character. And we've also developed a framework for resiliency. So I mentioned, when people throw terms around without defining them, they can become meaningless and overused. So we've defined resiliency, but then we've actually came up with a framework for how companies can actually implement resiliency. And what I'm going to do in the rest of the presentation is go over the framework and talk about what we see as on par practices, advanced practices, and then the truly differentiating practices. And in some cases, I won't be able to go over all three of these, but I'm going to try to highlight some of the things that we think are either advanced or differentiated. And in some cases too, companies really need to catch up with even the on par practices. There's some areas where I think all companies still remain weak. So these are the 7 pillars of business resiliency. This is the framework that we're talking about. And I'm actually now going to go through all 7 of them. But some of them you'll recognize because they're essential and they've been around for ages. You know, I mentioned that I've been in business continuity for 20 plus years. Some of the fundamentals, like being able to do a business impact analysis and coming up with strong continuity plans, companies are still falling down on that. The fundamentals of risk management, dependable IT, we're still falling down on a lot of the basics as an industry. And I think this is where companies like yourselves, companies like Forrester, we need to help our clients on some of the fundamentals. And then there are more sophisticated capabilities like automation, supply chain risk management, and then of course, crisis and incident management, where companies can do a much better job as well. And I'll talk more about workforce. You know, the thing with workforce is, you know, we look at this last year and a half of the pandemic and it's like, oh, great, remote work, that solves everything. Remote work is a piece of it. It's not enough. Not every job can be done remotely. So there's more to workforce contingency than just simple remote workforce planning. But we'll get into each one of these and also share some data and continue to share some anecdotes. So business impact analysis and continuity planning. You're talking to a lot of clients, so many of them, particularly the larger, more complex enterprises, they still have a hard time identifying by business unit their most critical functions, their critical business processes, the applications that they depend on, and then the dependencies of those applications throughout the tech stack. So what happens is often when they have crises, determining the root cause of the crisis and why they're down is actually incredibly problematic. The other thing is that a lot of their plans are generic. So too many companies actually have generic impact-based plans. So the assumption is you've lost all of your data center, or there's a huge impact on a loss of a facility. So we call that impact-based as opposed to scenario-based. Scenario-based is where you're actually planning for a very specific scenario. And there are scenarios where you really do need a dedicated plan. The pandemic is a perfect example. Other perfect examples of that is cybersecurity plans. You know, a loss of a data center because of technology failure is much different than when a company experiences a ransomware attack or another external cyber attack, like a DDoS attack, for example. Those recovery procedures are dramatically different than when you just have a technology failure or you've had a power failure in the data center. And right now, I would say most companies, as we've seen in the news, they're completely unprepared for ransomware attacks. They're completely unprepared for most cyber attacks. And it's interesting because that's the kind of attack, the kind of downtime where it requires coordination of multiple teams, all the way through up to the core business continuity team and a broader crisis response team as well. But there's a lot of issues here. As I mentioned, most companies don't have the contextual knowledge about their business to do really thorough planning. Their plans are too generic because they haven't identified the most probable high impact risks to the business and then created specific plans for those. The other thing which is concerning is the testing. Whether you're talking about business continuity exercises or you're talking about core IT disaster recovery tests, companies are not planning thoroughly at all. They're not taking advantage of the various types of testing. Everything from plan walkthroughs, basic plan walkthroughs to tabletop exercises, to more sophisticated simulations, to actual full failovers. The testing is just really abysmal across the board. I often tell clients if there's anything that you can do to improve your core resiliency is to test, and then test some more. The other thing is you're testing to actually fail and to find problems and address them, as opposed to testing to just check a box and to meet some sort of either compliance requirement or internal policy requirement. So the testing isn't thorough. and it's not done enough. It's also not done under realistic conditions too. During crises, as you all well know, it's hard to communicate. People are stressed, they're under duress. You can't make assumptions that everybody's available, or your best people or the most experienced people or the right people are available. So I often find companies too aren't testing under realistic conditions that they'll actually face when they face a crisis. Systemic risk, as I mentioned, we're seeing a dramatic increase in all types of risk events. What you'll see in most companies is risk management is probably one of the most immature areas within the organization. Not all companies actually have chief risk officers or even VPs of operational risk. In the cases where they even do have chief risk officers, which is most typical within like financial services and insurance company, that CRO, not chief revenue, but chief risk officer, is focused mostly on financial risk. So it's a lot of credit and market risk. They're really missing operational risk. And then the other thing we'll notice too is that they attack risks in silos. So you might have one team looking at different types of financial risk, another team looking at kind of strategy risk. The business continuity team is looking at traditional risk related to, again, like extreme weather, workplace safety, you name it. IT is looking at their own set of risks, and you might even have cybersecurity teams looking at their own set of risks. But nowhere are they consistently tracking all of these risks and objectively assessing them and mitigating them and signing off on them. Risk is really inconsistent, and we see this over and over again. And I would even say, like, in some of the more clients that you would expect to be sophisticated, like financial services and insurance, even within their own practices, the risk management is very ill defined. Dependable IT. So every year, we actually run surveys with the Disaster Recovery Journal, and we focus on a different topic. One year we'll focus on business continuity, IT disaster recovery, and then overall enterprise risk management. Well, we ask companies, if you've actually invoked a plan, whether it's a specific IT disaster recovery plan or a business continuity plan, what was the cause of the disruption, the invocation? Technology failure is actually still number one. It's still the number one failure. And I would say here with large enterprises in particular, it is getting back to that technology debt and that technology complexity that I mentioned at the beginning. So much of it is, you do still get failures of infrastructure. A lot of it actually is human error. Some of the biggest sources of downtime, if people remember 4 or 5 years ago, the New York Stock Exchange was actually down for half a day. The New York Stock Exchange was down for half a day. It was actually because of a poor patch. And then there's been other technology failures. The airline industry has been plagued by technology failures. Years ago, there was a whole rash of technology failures from large banks in the UK. If you look at all those failures, a lot of it was all related to complexity. They had a small failure that could have been the result of, an infrastructure failure. In some cases, they actually had power failures or electrical failure. I mentioned human error again. These weren't extreme weather events that like took out an entire data center or flooded a data center. They were really small. They were isolated events. And it was because the environment was so complex. In many cases, they didn't understand those dependencies and why a single failure was causing such a cascade of events. And in some cases, they were having trouble getting to the root cause of it. And as I mentioned too, I have a lot of clients right now because of the complexity of the environment. Again, thousands of applications. They have hybrid environments where they have applications on premise, in the cloud, multiple cloud providers, a really complex infrastructure stack where it's heterogeneous technologies. A lot of it comes from the fact that they don't do long-range strategic planning and have a really strong enterprise architecture practice that's enforcing standards and consistency. So again, like any downtime is leading to these huge cascading failures. We've really got to start rethinking our approach to our infrastructure stack with an eye not just to efficiency and cost savings, but it's really got to be about resiliency and dependability by design. And I would say here too, clients are not testing. I have very few clients that actually can actually test a failover of their complete environment to an alternate site. Very few clients are actually in active data center configurations where, there is no sense of failover. There's high availability and disaster recovery. There's no distinction between the two. So this is just an area where you would think today there'd be a lot more sophistication, a lot more investment, but it actually continues to be one of the weakest areas for companies. Automation. So it was interesting, like talking with clients through the pandemic. Clients themselves were actually surprised at how much they still relied on paper within their environment. 67% of our clients said that a lot of their core business processes and functions still rely on paper. So there's huge opportunities within organizations for automation. It could be, back office functions related to finance and HR itself. There's a lot of automation that can help within IT. But we need more and more automation. Automation will reduce the amount of human error in the environment. Automation, as we saw during the pandemic, it'll help us move to more digital experiences. It'll help us deal with higher rates of employee absenteeism in the future. Or it could be actual automation of core manufacturing processes, as an example. Like in the pandemic, everybody thought like, oh, the answer to everything is remote work. There's a lot of industries and a lot of functions where you still have to arrive in person. So we looked in manufacturing, particularly in meat processing, for example, where like people were working side by side. There's a lot of automation that would solve those challenges in the future. Again, providing safer environments, and then also protecting the business from risk if you do actually have really high rates of employee absenteeism. But there is a huge amount of automation that needs to happen within organizations. Even within development, where you think back to the future fit strategy about being creative and adaptive, your ability to roll out new experiences and new applications, the whole development process from start to finish, from development all the way through to testing to deployment, huge opportunities for automation within there. Workforce contingency. We did see, within the pandemic, how many firms were able to switch to remote work. Some easier than others. It was interesting. Even within the same industry, you saw a really wide range of experiences. I had this one client who was a mid-sized financial services firm. Mid-size. I mean, they were still a fairly large firm. They really struggled. I mean, they were buying laptops on the fly. Because they hadn't provisioned employees with laptops ahead of time. When they did send employees home to work, they had tons of scalability issues. When everybody logged in at 9 a.m., their systems crashed because they couldn't handle the performance load. From a security perspective, they had to forego some of their security policies. When it came to identity and access management, they actually had to send employees home with hardware tokens. I haven't seen a hardware token since, I think, the early 2000s. This was the last time I actually used a hardware token. And then in the same industry, same size firm, I had a client with a completely opposite experience. All their employees had already been provisioned for laptop. If you looked at all their remote offices, they had invested for infrastructure and scale. They had multiple network connections. They had enough bandwidth. They'd already been able to work remotely. They were completely opposite. They were able to handle it with a blink of an eye. So this links back to technology debt and technology complexity. Your ability to have transitioned to a remote workforce depended on a lot on the investments that you had already made. The other thing I would say about workforce, again, not every employee can work from home in every industry. So we saw a lot of companies that hadn't really thought through other strategies for succession planning for key roles, as an example. The ability to shift workloads to other regions and other parts of the world. The ability to maybe hire contract workers and other contingent type workers as well. There's still even strategies around mobile recovery units, as an example. So not every scenario in every industry can just, the answer is remote work. And I still find this is an area where companies have a lot of work to do, even now. I think the pandemic was a good wake-up call about the importance of workforce planning, but there's still more work to do here. Supply chain, supply chain risk. This past year was interesting. It exposed a lot of risk and failures in supply chains. A lot of companies that thought that they had addressed single points of failures realized that they hadn't. So just because you have multiple suppliers doesn't mean those suppliers aren't from the same region that are impacted by the same risk event. A lot of companies didn't actually understand their end-to-end supply chains. And you think about recently the ship that was stuck in the Suez Canal. How many companies realized that they would be affected by that? Did they even understand how things were being shipped for them? So there's a huge emphasis on really understanding the supply chain end to end. It is about more than just having multiple vendors. It's making sure that you're not exposed to regional dependencies and not just vendor dependencies. There's a lot of focus on sustainability here as well within supply chains. But this is an area where it is incredibly manual. There's not a lot of intelligence or insight about the supply chain end to end. And now there is a huge focus on it, both to obviously address the risks, but this is an area where I've also seen a huge emphasis on sustainability as well. There's huge companies, for example, like Walmart and Apple, that are planning to completely decarbonize their supply chain within the next couple of decades. And so this is having a dramatic impact on larger suppliers as well as smaller suppliers as well. Companies are re-examining their balance of offshoring versus nearshoring as another example here. And then, of course, last but not least is the crisis management piece of it. This is an area where I think it's another area of weakness, probably on par with what I've seen with risk management and even core continuity planning. When I talk to a lot of organizations about crisis management, they still sort of associate it more with physical security. It's run by physical security teams, and the emphasis is more on workplace safety and workplace physical safety, as opposed to the organization being able to handle any type of crisis with a cross-functional team representing multiple parts of the business and multiple parts of that resiliency committee, if you will. It does have to be physical security. It has to be business continuity. It has to be cybersecurity, IT disaster recovery, parts of the business. I don't see a lot of companies, well, there's room for improvement. You can see the stat here, 35% of firms are investing in what we kind of call crisis command center solutions or critical event management solutions. Huge opportunities here. Even on core crisis communication, I find that there's high adoption, but companies aren't using the full breadth of the solutions and the capabilities within these solutions, the sophistication of the solutions. They're not really using them as intelligent communication platforms. They're still sort of treating them as basic mass notification. So whether it's intelligent communication or true virtual command center capabilities for that kinds of situational awareness that'll let you change your response or adapt to conditions as things unfold. Because the crisis never unfolds exactly the way you planned for it in your continuity plan. You need the flexibility to make decisions on the fly, make new decisions, just be much more flexible. So a lot of effort needs to be placed here as well. But this is just to take you through what we're telling our clients, understanding the future fit strategy, those 3 pillars, understanding just how important resiliency is. And then resiliency isn't an abstract concept. It has a very specific definition. There's a framework. And the framework isn't something that you approach serially. You do each one of those things one at a time. You want to actually focus on the pillars holistically. And in some cases, there's a lot of overlap between the pillars. You take automation, for example. Automation applies to everything. It applies to the business. Like what kinds of back office functions can you automate? What kinds of IT processes can you automate? What parts of the actual crisis response can you actually automate? So automation plays a role in multiple pillars, as well as it being a standalone pillar itself. The first two pillars, BIA and risk management, those go hand in hand as well. So you're approaching the pillar holistically, not just serially as well. And then when in doubt, if you want to prioritize your efforts, focus on things that are critical to your ultimate end customer and work backwards from there. Interesting, that's a picture of a water bear. It's a microscopic creature. It lives in every environment on Earth. It can survive in extreme weather conditions. It can survive being starved, dehydrated. It can actually survive in space. So we always want to tell clients, like, you want to be like the water bear, surviving under every single condition.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Well, sadly, we are approaching the end of the session, but as a reminder, this session was being recorded, so be on the lookout for the on-demand video. With that, I want to give a big thanks to our speaker, Stephanie, and thank you, our audience, for taking time out of your busy day to join us. We look forward to seeing you at a future webinar. Have a great day.